patients is also matched. You can have here an idea of the meaning of a match. You see the glucose going up and down, and you can measure this this spike, and you can put mathematically all together to have the match. And it was able to show that the only strong predictor of isoprostane excretion was the match. So suggesting that in vivo, when glucose goes up and down, oxidative stress is produced. And we confirm this evidence in a little bit more sophisticated way, because in type 2 diabetic patients, we clamped glycemia for 24 hours at 15 millimole liter or at 10 millimole liter, or going up and down every 6 hours from 5 to 15, then again 5 to 15. Why this design? 15 is the peak value. However, the most interesting information came comparing clamping 10 versus going up and down. Because in this way, you compare exactly the same amount of glucose, only infused in a different way. So, if you stay for 24 hours at stable 10, or you go up and down, you infuse the same amount of glucose. However, when you go up and down, you see the effect on endothelial function as well on oxidative stress generation is worsened than maintaining constantly high glucose. And the very bad information is coming from this paper from my friend Simona Frontoni from Rome, because they show that an impaired glucose variability, but also blood pressure variability, which is another side of the story, is associated with endothelial and cardiovascular damage in short-term diabetic patients with optimal metabolic control. So in other way, even if you have a patient in a good metabolic control with a good A1C, but the glucose goes widely up and down, this is not good, because anyhow you have a damage of endothelial function and of a cardiovascular system. And also you see that glucose variability can contribute to activate platelet and also producing an oxidative stress. And if you have a glucose variability during myocardial salvage, after an acute myocardial infarction, you do not do a very good job, because you worsen the prognosis of the myocardium. However, variability of glycemia does not mean only hyperglycemic peaks. On the contrary, an important part of the story is related to hypoglycemia. And higher is variability, higher is the risk of getting hypoglycemia. And today, we know that hypoglycemia is something very bad. I'm sure you know these key trials, particularly you know that in the Accord, the Accord trial was stopped earlier because an increased percent of death. And also you know that one of the possible cause is considered hypoglycemia, even because in intensive treatment arm, there was more hypoglycemia. Probably was the price paid to get a better control. And the incidence of severe hypoglycemia was higher in intensive group than intensive standard group, so suggesting that in the Accord trial, hypoglycemia could have played a role. A concept which was stressed also in the VADT, where hypoglycemia was strongly related to the risk of cardiovascular death. And if you see in advance the whole picture, you see the adverse outcomes among patients with type 2 diabetes experiencing severe hypoglycemia. And you see that higher was the incidence of hypoglycemia, higher was the risk to get the complications, particularly cardiovascular complications. More recently, there is another evidence linking hypoglycemia and acute cardiovascular events in type 2 diabetes. In this paper published by Johnston, it was a retrospective study with a huge number of people. You see more than 800,000 people. And there was an association between hypoglycemic events and acute cardiovascular events. And patients with hypoglycemic events had 79% higher odds of acute cardiovascular events than patients without hypoglycemic events. And very recently, this has been confirmed in another cohort in which hypoglycemia and the risk of cardiovascular disease and all-cause mortality in insulin-treated people with type 1 and type 2 diabetes has been evaluated, and the conclusion is that hypoglycemia is associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular events and all-cause mortality in insulin-treated patients with diabetes. The relationship between hypoglycemia and CV outcomes and mortality exists over a long period. So it seems really that hypoglycemia does some very bad effect, has very bad effects on the cardiovascular system. Why? But you know that when we speak about the glucose spikes, we know that several mechanisms are activated when hyperglycemia goes suddenly up. However, evidence are suggesting that exactly the same happens when you have a hypoglycemia. So, an acute hypoglycemia resembles what happens during an acute hyperglycemia. It is not so surprising that there's a lot of evidence are coming out suggesting that hypoglycemia is a pro-atherosclerotic factor. In other words, evidence are today suggesting that any episode of hypoglycemia contributes as any acute episode of hyperglycemia to the development of atherosclerosis, which we know is one of the most important complications of diabetes. However, the story, just speaking about the challenges, is a little bit more complicated. Because when you have hypoglycemia, the aim of any physician is to recover from hypoglycemia as soon as possible. And honestly, we do this in any way. Several years ago, in this paper, it was shown in cells, neurons, and in rats, that when a hypoglycemia was produced and then recovered with a normal glycemia or hyperglycemia, the effect was dramatically different. Particularly, when the hypoglycemia was recovered producing a hyperglycemia, the level of glucose was able to induce a huge oxidative stress. And the conclusion of the paper is that the degree of superoxide is a very bad free radical, production and the neuronal death increased with increasing glucose concentration during the perfusion period after hypoglycemia. In other words, this paper showed that when you recover from hypo, producing a hyperglycemia, this produces ischemia reperfusion-like effect, which I believe is well known in the cardiology. No? When after myocardial infarction, there is a ischemia reperfusion effect, and we know that this can produce the stunning myocardium. So we have the same possibility in diabetes? Unfortunately, yes, because we demonstrated that inducing a hypoglycemia in both healthy people of type 1 diabetes, when we recovered with normoglycemia, the effect, for example, on endothelial function, the endothelial function was recovered. However, when we produce hyperglycemia, you see here, the effect on endothelial function was to worsen the situation. However, please pay attention to another aspect. Inducing hyperglycemia, recovering with the normal glycemia, was accompanied by an improvement or recovery of endothelial function. However, this needed time. After 4 hours, endothelial function after hypoglycemia was still damaged. And we needed almost 10 hours for to completely recover endothelial function. And these data are consistent with the very recent evidence regarding the effect of acute and antecedent hypoglycemia and endothelial function and markers of atherothrombotic balance in a healthy man, where the authors, this is just in press paper in diabetes, concluded that antecedent hypoglycemia results in a greater endothelial dysfunction and an increased pro-atherothrombotic state as compared to a single acute episode of hypoglycemia. So it means, okay, we were producing a ischemia reperfusion effect. It means that also you have a metabolic, a memory-like effect even when you have hypoglycemia. And this, in my opinion, is a very bad news. What can we do to treat in the right way our patients, I think? This is a very obvious suggestion. And it's not enough to lower glycemia. For example, if you just cut the level of hyperglycemia, you just increase the risk of producing hypoglycemia. So to pay attention only to constant hyperglycemia is not the best strategy, but we have to try to avoid also this fluctuation in order to avoid or increase the risk of hypoglycemia. When we see the available insulins, and particularly the profiles, we see the profiles of NPH, we see the profile of glargine, we see the profile of detemir, and we see the profile of Degludec, which currently is the best in terms of the smooth profile. So Degludec is able to really give this constant profile in terms of plasma concentration. At this pace, because in this paper, where the glargine and Degludec were directly compared in terms of impact on glucose variability, you see here that Degludec won. Degludec was able to produce less variability of glucose over time than glargine. So I know that some of you can be disappointed because I'm putting on the basket more challenge than solutions. However, I believe that it's time to pay attention also to this other aspect of diabetes management. We learned in the past years that to control glycemia is important, to control at a very early stage glycemia is important to prevent metabolic memory. We learned that maybe controlling PPG is also important because space in terms of particular better glycemic control. We have today learned that glycemic variability must be avoided in order to improve the prognosis of our patients, and this is the main challenge. We have to get this avoiding hypoglycemia. And this, in my opinion, is the most challenging story today we have in the management of diabetes. And let me conclude with another hope. Because, sorry, 2 seconds, I will finish, just 2 seconds. Because we were able to show that during both an acute hyperglycemia or an acute hypoglycemia, the concomitant infusion of GLP-1 can really help to prevent what they produced. And you know that the GLP-1 receptor agonists are now coming also in the management of type 1 diabetes. So this may add some more possibility for the management, particularly also of type 1 diabetes. So we have challenges, but also today we are quite lucky because we have good tools in order to afford this battle against diabetes, that today is really a worldwide, unfortunately, really fight. Thank you very much.